All right, let's talk about what the third house symbolizes and what the seventh house symbolizes and what is symbolized by a combination between the two houses. How would you get a combination between two houses? Basically, one way to do it is via their lords. So, for example, if you have the third lord in the seventh house, or the seventh lord in the third house, or the third and seventh lords conjoined or mutually aspecting each other. Another way that houses can combine or work together is by virtue of them coming in a sequence in terms of how prominent they are. So if like 7 is your most prominent house and third is your least prominent, then they're pulling on each other. If 7 is your most prominent house and third is your next most prominent, then they're pushing with each other. To understand that, it takes a little bit more work. So I offer a report that will tell you that. It's called the Houses of Life Report. You can go to my website to order it. The website address is vicdecara.com. There's a link below. Okay, so now let's talk about the third house. The third house is the area of sky that's underground, but it's on the eastern side of the underground. That's the symbolic key to understanding what it represents. So based on that, there are two important things to understand about the third house to be able to figure out everything that it symbolizes. The first is that this is the house for ability. In other words, the ability to realize things. The ability to translate a desire into an accomplishment. This is the first strand of the backbone of what the third house is all about, that kind of ability. And the other strand is the desire, the inspiration to get things for yourself, what we desire for ourselves. I will point out 6 things, 3 on each spine, that are essential for understanding the third house. The first thing is this is the house of skill, because it's about ability, right? So that means skill, talent, the ability to translate something which is an idea or a feeling into something tangible and real. The other thing about the third house is it's not only skillful, but it's forceful. Because we're taking feelings and making them solid by bringing them east. So it's about assertion and materialization. So it's strong, muscular, even forceful and assertive. And this bleeds over or blends over into another thing about the third house, which is this is where you have your bravery. This is where you have your willpower and your discipline. And your drive. And that segues over to the other spine of what the third house represents, which is this is what we want for ourselves. These are our desires. And therefore it gives us our drives. So it's the house for passion or drives, motivations, lusts, what I want. Hence, the third house is individualistic. It's showing your sense of individuality and how willing you are to put yourself first. And as a result of putting yourself first, you will come to compete rather than cooperate. You'll compete. So third house is very important for seeing how well you do in competition and how well you compete and how well you deal with competitors. And this is also in the same square of meaning. This is why it has to do with your competitors, who fairly humorously, by the way, include your siblings because they're your peers. Competitors are always our peers. So that's what you should know about the third house. Really, everything that the third house could possibly represent is some kind of a variation on one of those things that's on the screen right now. Let's do that same analysis for the seventh house so that we understand it clearly before we move on and talk about how the third house acts when it combines with the seventh. So the seventh house, it's literally the central point or the anchor point of the western part of the sky. It's literally based on the western horizon. And so the seventh house symbolizes everything that the west symbolizes, and everything the West symbolizes is based on the fact that it's where the sun sets. So the 7th house is going to have to do with things disappearing, like the sunset, and also it's going to have to do with things that are not me. The sun rising in the east represents the birth of the self, the person, the individual. When it sets in the west, then that individual is not prominent anymore. Other people become prominent. So those are the two backbones of meaning for the 7th house. Other people and disappearing. That's why one of the things that everybody gets right when they think about what the 7th house means, they say it has to do with marriage. That's correct. It's a very important thing about the 7th house. It has to do with how we deal with and how well we work with other people, how we cooperate. But it's not so much a romantic house, but it's more of a partnership and cooperation house. And so it has to do with a lot with negotiation, compromise, etc. And therefore it has a big effect on commerce because it has to do with how well we exchange and trade and make deals with other people. Those are three very important things about the 7th house that are fairly well known. The other three things based on the sunset being the disappearing place are not so well known, but nonetheless very true. The 7th house is a very important house for relocation or travel because the sun disappearing signifies things going away and going someplace else. So the 7th house has that nature to it. It signifies things going somewhere else, things traveling or moving or going somewhere. So things going someplace else also means they're not accumulating, they're dispersing. So the 7th house will disperse things or diffuse things or make things lighter or less constant. And finally, the 7th house has to do with the ending of things. The sun sets there. So it's also the ending of life, and it indicates death. This is little known about the 7th house. People might complain that it should be the 8th house or something else, but it is really the 7th house. And so that's basically everything you need to know. More than basically, that is literally everything you need to know about the 7th house. And now, if all that makes sense to you, then I think you're ready to go on and talk about what would happen if the 3rd house and the 7th house combine in a chart. So whenever you want to figure out how to interpret a combination of anything in an astrological chart, you always use this basic technique of asking, what does thing A have in common with thing B? And are they both pro this thing, or is one pro and the other anti? If they're both pro or both anti, then it will go good. But if one is pro and the other anti, then it will get a little bit problematic. So with the 3rd house and the 7th house, there's a big problematic issue here. Did you spot it? Maybe you already spotted it or it already dawned on you. What do you think? The 3rd house is how we feel to ourselves. So it's about our lusts, our passions, our self-desires. It's therefore very individualistic. The 7th house is where the sun sets. The I is not so important here. The other people are important here. So the 7th house is very cooperative. The 3rd house is very competitive. The 7th is very cooperative. The 3rd is very self-oriented. The 7th is very partnership-oriented. So they're actually talking about the same subject, which is how you relate with other people. But the 3rd house is saying, you are important, and the 7th house is saying, they are important. So it's an example where one is pro and one is anti. And so the 3rd and the 7th house are kind of a problematic group of houses to combine. The effect will be slightly different depending upon which house is the prominent one, the one where the action is taking place. If the 3rd house is the prominent one, like the action is taking place in the 3rd house, then it's the cooperation which is difficult. The 7th house will be the one that suffers. If the 7th house is the one where the action is taking place, then it's the 3rd which will suffer. So if the focal point is in the 3rd house, then cooperation is difficult. If the 7th house is the focal point, then independence is difficult. What do I mean by independence? I mean the ability to be self-motivated, have your own personal ambitions, etc. That will be problematic or difficult for the person. How do you determine which house is the focal point? So if you're getting 7th Lord going to 3, then I would say 3 is the focal point. If you're getting 3 going to 7, then 7 is the focal point. If you're getting combinations by virtue of conjunction, then the dominant planet is the focal point. If you have the report that I am offering on my website, link below. If you have that report and you're seeing 7 come first and then 3 being in second, then 3 is supporting 7, so 7 is the main focus. Vice versa, if 3 comes first and then 7, then 3 is the main point. If 3 is on the positive side and 7 on the left side, then 3 is the focal point. If 7 is on the positive side, 3 on the negative side, then 7 is the focal point. Okay? So now that's technical stuff is ironed out. Let's talk more about this interpretive theory again. The basic vibe that's going on when the 3rd and the 7th house are interacting is that cooperation and independence are fighting with each other. Cooperation and competition are fighting. Independence and partnership are fighting. And it can either play out as being you find it very difficult to cooperate, or it could be opposite. You find it very difficult to be competitive and you find it very difficult to be independent. So let me explain some of the expected, the ways that this will probably look in a person's life. If you have 3 focal point where it's difficult cooperation, this would probably look like a person that finds it annoying or irritating to be in partnerships, so they get out of the partnerships because they're not enjoying being in them. So what happens, therefore, is the fruits that are to be obtained through a partnership don't come about. And so this has a big impact on childbirth, which is what the classic texts often say about 3 and 7 combination, is that it has a negative impact on childbirth, because childbirth is the fruit of the partnership of marriage. And when you have a difficult cooperation issue, you don't like partnership, so the marriages become problematic before they produce fruits, or they can end before they produce fruits. And it's not only in terms of children, but in any kind of way that you would be wanting to get something out of a partnership, business partnership, anything, you'll find that your need to be independent and your need to be number one and not supportive of others is going to interfere with the ability to get stuff from partnerships. Now, let's say a couple of things about what the other side of the coin actually looks like. The side of the coin where 7 is the focal point, and it's independence, which is difficult. So this looks like a person who does not have a lot of self-motivation. This person is much more happy to be asked or told by somebody else to do something. They prefer to do things for others. They don't really know even what to do for themselves. And so they have a kind of slow nature to them. They're not very catalytic. They don't catalyze others to action. They don't really have a lot of inspiration or motivation for themselves. They're kind of slow. And if this works in a good way, they can be quite patient and selfless. And another thing that's been said about this combination in classical texts is that they find service under the king. So in other words, they like to be told what to do. So they're going to prefer, this is the kind of person that would get along well with a dominant partner, because they're happy being submissive and self-sacrificing. That's basically what's up with 3 and 7. There's one other way of looking at this, which basically gives you the same results anyway. There's one other phrase that you can bring up from 3 and 7. Is that 3 is very assertive or strong, but 7 is very dispersive or weak or mild. But you'll expect the same result from this, in that the native will therefore be weak, in the sense of they're not strongly driven. They'll be frightened easily, or easily dissuaded. Easily dissuaded. Even if it's 3, which is prominent, and they're self-oriented, they get out of the relationships fast because they're easily dissuaded. They don't have like that discipline and willpower. And another interesting thing, when you put 3 into difficulty, house 3 into difficulty, it indicates problems of expressing or vocalizing or asserting what you actually want. So this is an example of some of the fascinating things that you can interpret out of astrology charts just by considering what houses are combining with which. You can do that by just looking at how the lords combine, but you really may miss some important information if you don't know how the houses line up in their prominence sequence. So I'll just end the video by reminding you about the report, The Houses of Life. You can get that from my site, and then we'll give you a clear code of which houses are in which order of prominence for you. Thanks so much. Don't forget to like and subscribe and ring the bell so that you get notifications of my next video.